All right, we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to head and get started. I will start it, introduce you, and then hand it off.
Very good.
Okay. All right, welcome to NNP Symposium. This is the 1 o'clock Eastern Time presentation, Coins and English Translations of the New Testament, presented by Bill Sommers. This presentation reflects Sommers' collection of coins contemporary to English translations of the New Testament from the Old English gloss of the Lindisfarne Gospels around 960 to the American Standard Version in 1901. This collection is intended to explore what coins the translators had available, why they might have used these coins in their translations, and how they compare and contrast. So with that, Bill, I will hand it off to you.
Okay, thank you, Len. Okay, so collecting coins referenced in the New Testament that were contemporary to the time of Jesus is relatively common. It's relatively well documented. The extension that I'll be talking about today is I became interested in the coins that various translators used in their translations, why they used these coins, what did they have in their pocket, what did they have in their mind or their readers have in hand when they were reading these. So I like the historical aspect of this. That's how I got into numismatics, was from the history point of view. So it's great to learn about these time periods, maybe some of the challenges associated with these translators. And I think it's important that coins are such an important part of our everyday life. And, you know, Jesus knew that and worked that into his ministry. The gospel writers knew that, and the translators were trying to echo that. So I'll be talking about a few translations today, kind of milestone translations, certainly not all of them. Mostly English. We'll do one detour or roundabout into German, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But these span overall a millennium of time, so a lot of different types of coins and periods. And we'll just analyze and compare and contrast them. These are all coins from my collection. They're all photographed to the same scale, and all the weights are of my coins, so they're not necessarily, there is some shaving going on, so there's not necessarily the original weights of the coins. Let's start with a little background to set the stage. This is information about the oldest surviving New Testaments that we have. You'll see this slide for every translation. It's a common form. I've got the various books and the verses shown that I'm referring to. These are not all the verses that refer to coins, but these are really the major ones. I've got a quick little reference context there for what the story is that's being told in that verse. And then in here, in this case, I've got the Greek version from the mid-4th century. These are from the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, the two oldest ones that we have. And then the final column is from the Latin Vulgate version by St. Jerome in the early 5th century. And these are very similar. There's a lot of commonality here. Just a few minor differences I'll point out is that in Mark, he talks about the widow's contribution being 2 lepta equal to a quadrans, whereas Luke just says 2 lepta. He doesn't define that as a quadran. And in the Latin version, that's called a minuta. And those are really not coins so much. Those are just terms to mean a very small coin or something very small. Also, you'll notice that for the pay your last coin stories, you see that in blue. By the way, the color coding indicates stories that are similar. In Matthew, we've got the pay your last coin story that references the quadrans. And down in Luke, where we have the pay your last coin, it's a lepton and the minutum that we talked about. One other difference is that in the case of Luke 12:16, this is the cost of 5 sparrows. We see that in the Greek, they call that 2 Assyrians, 2 azes, whereas in the Latin version, they call that a dipundio or dipundius, which is a 2 Assyrian coin. So this is like trying to say, is it 2 nickels or is it a dime or is it 10 cents? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's jump in now to what's going on in English, and we'll start here with Old English. There was a gospel produced in the island of Lindisfarne. And by the way, my background today is the island of Lindisfarne. It's actually not an island at low tide. You can walk to it, but the rest of the time of the day, it's a beautiful island that I'd like to visit someday. But in 1715, the monks on that monastery there made a very beautiful document reflecting the Latin Vulgate Bible. And you see a page there from that. It's a very important artifact from the Anglo-Saxon period, both for the Celtic artwork as well as for the language information it provides. But for our purposes today, what's important happened a couple centuries later in 960 when a scribe named Aldred added a word-for-word gloss to these Gospels. And a gloss just literally means writing in between the lines what every word, Latin word, means in Old English. And you can see some of the chicken scratch. If you look over there in between the pretty lines, you see some of the chicken scratch. That is his gloss. And so that's really like a Rosetta Stone going between the Latin and the Old English. And this was not done at Lindisfarne. The Vikings had repeatedly attacked that island later that century. So the monks packed up their Bible and packed up their artifacts and relics and moved to Chesley Street near Durham. So that's actually where this gloss was performed. Shortly thereafter, there were similar translations done called the West Saxon or Wessex Gospels. These are not a gloss. They are more of a translation, although kind of a crude translation, still in Old English. And they did rely probably pretty heavily on Aldred's gloss. But there were multiple copies likely done in Canterbury, and these showed up dated between 990 and 1175. So these are sort of peers, if you will, and we'll talk about them together. So here you see the same verses that we talked about before, but now we have a column for what was in the Lindisfarne gloss and what was in the West Saxon gloss. And the coins that are highlighted with borders there with black boxes are coins we're going to talk about in detail. So I won't go in that on this particular slide. I will just point a few things out, though, a few teasers I don't really have time to go into. But under the Matthew 17 temple tax story, the gloss actually has that that would be a tetradrachm in the Greek, but he translated that as 4 thremses. So that's kind of an area I'm getting more interested in the future, but I won't have time to talk about today. And then lower down, you'll see that for the lost coin, which was a drachma in the Greek, he translates that actually as 5 skeets. So he couldn't get a one-to-one coin reference, so he did something interesting and went to an integral number of coins. Both the thremsa and the skeets would have been very old coins, even in Aldridge's day. So it's kind of interesting that he went back to those. And those are kind of some coins that I'll be looking at in the future. Maybe I'll do another talk sometime. And then under the West Saxon version, I'll just point out that you'll notice in Matthew, the cost of the 2 sparrows is a penny. And under Luke, the cost of 5 sparrows is a halfpenny. So not a bad deal, the kind of thing my wife would love on a shopping trip. So let's delve into some of the coins from these translations. We'll start with this Styka from the Lindisfarne gloss. The coin that you see there on the right, and by the way, this format of slide you'll be seeing repeatedly, will have the old coin, the ancient coin on the right. In this case, that's a small pruta, which is a Judean coin that was really the most ubiquitous coin in the land at the time that Jesus would have told this story. It's actually a very old coin. This particular one was minted probably 100 years before that story, but it's well documented that these coins were used even 100 years after this story. So they used their coins for a long time, particularly this one. These are the most prolific coin in Judea, so probably the most likely contender for what that coin would have been. This is a coin of King Alexander for Alexander Jannaeus. You'll see that there's a star and a diadem on one side with his name in Hebrew and an anchor on the other side with his name in Greek. And the coin that Aldred glossed to this, and I've actually pulled out the original text there. You can see the beautiful calligraphy for the Latin, and then you can see his not so beautiful scratch for the gloss. But it says Styka there in Old English, and this is a copper coin minted in Northumbria. The one I collected was minted between 843 and 850 under the reign of Ethelred II, and the moneyer there is Erdwulf. And one of the things I try to do when I'm collecting here, since I want common coins, I want coins that they would have had. I try to get coins that are common, which is the antithesis of what a lot of coin collecting is after. And he was a very prolific, he minted, both the king and this particular moneyer minted a large volume of coins. So that improved my odds that this was a coin that they might have seen or been familiar with. You'll notice that the Styka is larger than the Pruta, but it does have a similar mass. As far as worth, even this Styka, which is a very lowly coin, at a tenth of a pence or so, was still worth much more than the lepton, which was a mere 1/128th of a denarius. So it's hard to really get your head around how worthless really these pruta or these lepta were back in that day. One other thing I'll point out that I kind of find interesting from the historical perspective is that kind of like this particular pruta had not been minted for a while when the story took place. Likewise, the Styka had not been minted for a good while when this gloss was made. It was probably a century old, rather akin to the pruta. And also this was the first small change coin that they had in Northumbria, probably in England. And one of the things about that, one of the reasons behind that was they wanted a coin, not only could you make change, but also a coin that would be small enough that the average person could donate to the church. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting parallel to the use of the pruta for the widow's contribution. So now let's talk to the penny, the ubiquitous penny, obviously the most common coin for English in England for centuries, maybe the only coin in England for a lot of that period. Very important here to the biblical reference. It's got certainly historical ties and through the denarius and the denier coming down through the ages. On the right, we see a denarius of Tiberius, who was the emperor when Jesus was alive. This particular coin was minted in Gaul, currently on France area between 15 and 35. It does indeed have, the story, the tribute story has whose image is on this coin and whose name is on this coin. And yea, verily, Tiberius has his image and his name are on this coin. And you see the Greek formation there above. And the coin I collected from the gloss, and again, you see the pulling that out. It says penny from the gloss, is a penny that was minted in Northumbria. And so not only do I try to get the right period, but I try to get the right location. So I looked hard to find a coin that actually was minted in York, which is the closest mint to Northumbria, which is where this translation was being glossed. So I like to try to get that context as much as I can. This is for a king called Eadred, by a moneyer there on the back of the coin called Ingilgar. And both of these were very, Eadred was not king for very long, but it turned out that Ingilgar was a mentor for at least 4 or 5 of these kings. They tended to change back and forth between English kings and Viking kings very rapidly in that area. And he was obviously able to support both sides. So he was a moneyer for a long period of time. So again, that kind of improves my odds that this would have been something they would have been familiar with. I also selected a coin of Eadred because Eadred actually visited the monastery there in Chesley Street. Actually right before these glosses were made, this gloss was made. So there's even a chance that he met the monk or that they saw each other. So I kind of like, again, that historical emphasis. Obviously the penny is a little larger than the denarius. It's a lot thinner and a lot lighter, but they do have similar worth. They're both worth about a daily wage. And this daily wage for a laborer is going to be my value context throughout. That was the value context that Jesus was presenting and the Gospels present, and I'll be continuing that as we go forward in time. So going to the farthing now from the West Gospels. Of course, there was no farthing at this time, so a farthing would have referred to a cut penny. And in this case, that farthing was actually applied to 2 different coins. It was applied to both the small pruta that we've talked about before, as well as to the quadrans. And now the quadrans was the smallest Roman coin of the day. Several biblical references to that in different verses. This one was minted in Rome around 5 BC, around the time Jesus was probably born. There's an altar there on one side, and on the other side is the SC for Senatus Consulto. The emperor tended to have control over the silver and gold coins, whereas the Senate was given control over the bronze coins. And so the coin I collected for this is a cut coin, a cut quarter from a silver penny. This was minted between 991 and 997. This is for King Ethelred the Unready. It's a different king than what we talked about before. And it was minted in London. And it's actually, it's called the short voided cross, and it's cut right along the cross as you might expect. You can see an R in one of those quadrants. There's a CRVX in those quadrants. We'll see those on the next slide. And this one preserves the R from that. Obviously, that is similar in size to the pruta, a little smaller than the quadrans. It's lighter than both of those. And even at a mere quarter of a pence, it's worth much more than either of these coins. At only 1/64th of a denarius for the quadrans and 1/128th of a denarius for the lepton. The halfpenny, I like the fact that the Wessex Gospel included the halfpenny. There were actually a few halfpennies during this period of the Wessex Gospels, but they were very uncommon. So this most likely refers to, again, a cut coin. The coin of references, I mentioned it briefly before, is this Dipundius. It's a question of, the Greek version makes it sound like it's 2 Osarian, 2 Azas. The Latin version and makes it sound to me like it's one coin, of the same value. So that's why you could go either way on that. But this is a Dipondius, a very large. It's actually called orichalcum is the material. It's a little more valuable than regular bronze, not as valuable as gold. This one was minted during Jesus's life between 19 and 21 AD. It is another coin of Tiberius. And on the back, we see a caduceus, a little symbol there, a staff with a snake surrounded by a cornucopia on each side. And the coin that I have here to represent this translation is again a cut penny, a half cut penny from England, dated between 1136 and 1145. This was under King Stephen, and there's a cross moline is the motif on the obverse, and it's cut in half right along that cross. This is often called the Watford type because I believe there was a hoard found in Watford, England. So going to the ubiquitous penny from the Wessex Gospel, again, this coin is translated to represent two different coins, the denarius that we've talked about before on the bottom right, as well as the Isaurian on the upper right. This is a large bronze coin dated between 31 and 32, so very close to the time of Jesus' crucifixion. It does have Tiberius's name and image and portrait on the left, as well as again this Senatus Consulto on the right. The coin from the translation that I'm showing here is a silver penny. This is really the same penny that we saw the farthing of before. This is from 991 through 997. King Ethelred II, or King Ethelred the Unready, also called King Ethelred II, and also his second reign, not to confuse anything. This one was minted in London, and it is that crux type coin, so that you can maybe see the CRVX in the four quadrants or the regions between the cross of the reverse. Obviously, this coin is a little larger than the denarius, a lot smaller than the Isaurian, a lot thinner than both of those. Actually, the value, it's a pretty good match for the denarius. It does have a very similar value, but it is worth quite a bit more than the Isaurian, due primarily to the material differences. Okay, let's go forward now to Middle English, and we come to a translation by John Wycliffe. This was part of the first translation of the complete Bible, not just the New Testament, to English, and it was also the first to add chapter numbers. And I tell you, after doing some research and reading in the earlier versions, which have no chapter numbers or no verse numbers, and sometimes no spaces, no punctuation, no periods, I really relish having chapter numbers and verse numbers. Wycliffe really was a reformer. He preceded many of Martin Luther's concerns with the Roman Catholic Church. He was not authorized to do this translation, and between the last one we talked about and this one, unauthorized translations were banned. So even though he died before they could get to him, 43 years later, they exhumed his body and burned it for heresy. So obviously, that tells you a little bit about some of the risks that these translators were taking, and how important it was for them to get this out. This Bible is also important because it influenced the Bohemian reformer John Hus, and we'll talk about that connection a little bit later. So I'm going to talk about the three coins that we see there. I will just also call attention to the fact that because of that tie-in that I talked about earlier for the widow's contribution, in Mark we see that listed as 2 minutus, equal to a farthing, whereas in Luke we see that as 2 farthings. So I don't know that they probably spent a lot of time, maybe years, doing these translations. They might not have remembered what they had done in a previous one, or maybe there were multiple parties involved that were doing the translations for different parts, and Wycliffe was kind of pulling all this together and being the integrator. Okay, so let's talk about the farthing from the Wycliffe translation. This is applied as a substitute for both the small pruta that we have talked about before, as well as the quadrands, which we've also talked about before. The coin associated with this translation that I'm showing is a silver farthing. We now had farthing coins. I think that started in 1222, and this is a farthing minted between 1301 and 1310 for King Edward I. It was minted in London. And it has a very, the size is nicely between the two bronze coins that we see there. Obviously, it's a different material. It's certainly lighter than even the pruta, and much lighter than the quadrands. And I should point out here, I've got masses for all of these in grams. Again, these are the masses for my coins. Obviously, my farthing there has lost quite a bit around the edges. But even at only worth a quarter pence, this is still worth much more than the quadrands and a whole lot more than the lepton at that period. Going to the halfpenny referenced in Wycliffe's translation, this is applied to the Assyrian. We've talked about that before. The coin I show associated with this translation is a halfpenny, minted in England between 1371 and 1379. This is a Richard II. And when I pulled this out of storage recently to take some new pictures, it looks to me like he has on his COVID mask, and maybe in a little bit like the COVID virus there shown on the reverse. This is obviously a very different material coin, a very different size coin, a very different mass coin, but actually the values are not dramatically different due to inflation at this point in time. It's worth, the halfpenny is worth slightly more than the Oz, but they're in the same ballpark, interestingly enough. Going on to the ubiquitous penny from Wycliffe. Again, it's a surrogate for the denarius that we've talked about before. In this case, the penny shown is a silver penny dated between 1377 and 1399. This is a coin minted in York for Richard II. And it's obviously a little smaller. It's quite a bit thinner and much lighter than the denarius. And also inflation is starting to show now, and the daily wage in England was about a little over 3 pence a day. So all in all, this coin is actually worth less now. This penny is worth less than the denarius was in its day. So now I'm going to take a detour into German and the translation by Martin Luther. This translation was done about 5 years after he did his thesis. The famous theses he tacked on the door were in 1517. This translation is in 1522. He did this while he was sequestered away for his own protection in Wartburg Castle. And it's a very important document, not only from the translation point of view biblically, but also it really was a trendsetter in terms of being in the style of everyday speech. It was much more accessible to the German public due to the availability now of the printing press. He took a different starting perspective. He worked from a Latin translation by Erasmus that was based on the Greek text more so than the Latin Vulgate that all the previous translations had started with. He also really set the standard for the German language with this Bible. The German language was very fractionated at this point, and he really standardized that and set the modern style that was adopted by German writers thereafter. He was also very strongly influenced by John Hus. We talked about that and the influence that Wycliffe, the British translator, had on Hus. And now we see that coming back to Hus influencing Martin Luther. And then Martin Luther was a very strong influence to the next English translation we'll talk about by William Tyndale just a few years later. So that's a nice cycle for that segue through German there. We'll talk about the 3 coins I show there in boxes. The only one I'll point out here that's kind of interesting is for the widow's contribution. There was, again, no coin that was that small. He had the same problem that the English did. But Luther's solution was to make up a word or make up a coin. He calls it a scherflin. And there was a coin, a small coin, half a penny type coin called a share, and he added the flying to it to make that to essentially be a diminutive form of that coin with no other definition. So his creative solution to finding something that small was to make up something new. So going to the first coin from Luther, this is called a heller. Heller is the word meaning bright. This was a silver coin. It was presented in the translation as a surrogate for both the pruta and the quadrands. You see the coin I've selected there on the left is a silver coin from Saxony, minted in 1515, a very light coin. This one came from the city of a lot of the cities had mints. This was from the city mint at Erfurtstadt. I liked that location because that's where Luther was ordained as a priest. Also, interestingly, this is a one-side coin. There was only one die. So what you see on the reverse is literally just the negative or the opposite of what you saw on the obverse. And there you just see a sort of a crest there denoting giving away the city and a little bit of information about the date. There's a very light coin, much lighter than the pruta, particularly, and of course the quadrands. This German heller was worth about a half of a German penny, which probably was about the equivalent of an English farthing at the time. So, but even still, it's still worth more than the quadrands and quite a bit more than the lepton. Going to Luther's penny or pfennig that he used, he did not translate this as a surrogate for the denarius. He translated this as a surrogate for the Assyrian, the bronze coin we had talked about earlier. This particular pfennig that I show, again, came from Saxony, silver coin dated between 1507 and 1525. If you look above those shields, those coats of arms, you can make out an FIG. Those stand for the first initial of Friedrich, Johann, and George, the three dukes of Saxony at that time. And we'll talk more about Friedrich on an upcoming slide. This was also a one-sided coin, as I talked about before. Obviously, much smaller than the Assyrian, a different material than the Assyrian, much thinner than the Assyrian. And this pfennig is worth a little bit less than an English penny, and because of that, it's actually worth slightly less than the Assyrian at a 16th of a denarius. Going to the last Luther coin, this is a groschen. This is representing two coins, the denarius in the lower right that we've talked about before, as well as the drachma, which we haven't talked about before. This is the coin from the lost coin story. The one I show here is a drachma. I guess it's covering up my screen there, but it's a drachma from the time of Christ. It is a coin of Tiberius, and it has Helios, the sun god, on the reverse. The coin here that Luther used is a groschen. This is a silver coin minted in Saxony between 1486 and 1525. This is another coin of Friedrich III that I mentioned, or Friedrich the Wise. He was a real protector of Luther. He founded the University of Wittenberg where Luther taught. He was an advocate for Luther. He's the one who kidnapped Luther for his own good and put him away at his castle for protection. And that's where he ended up doing the translation. So if it wasn't for Friedrich, we probably wouldn't even have a Luther translation at our disposal. Groschen means big. Gross means big. This is a gross, big coin, big denarius, big penny. It's worth about 10 to 12 German pennies. And actually at this time, even though it's much larger, it probably has a very comparable worth to both the denarius and the drachma in their day, in the time of Jesus. So it's a very good match from a value perspective. It's a very, very thin coin. One thing I'll point out here, I forgot to point this out with one of the earlier pennies, is a lot of these pennies no longer have a portrait on them. And so, part of that story is whose image is on this coin and whose name is on this coin. And we usually have the names. The kings like to have their names there, but the portraits are not always there. So it does put a bit of a dichotomy there in the story and the coin that's actually referenced in the story. So let's go back to English now. And now we're finally up to modern English. And this is really the first mass-produced English translation by William Tyndall. This is also important in that whereas the other translations so far had been more word-for-word types with maybe a little bit of grammar in there for English, this really is a true thought-for-thought type translation. So he's trying more to capture the essence the best way he can in the modern English language, rather than to try to be word-for-word correlated to the Latin or the Greek. But unfortunately, translations were not authorized at this point. He requested the permission to do a translation from the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall. That was denied, but he was a very driven man, and he went to the continent, into the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and completed his translation there, and did some of the early printing of those and smuggling those into England from there. But Tunstall was very adamant. He condemned the translation. He burned every copy he could find in public, and he was instrumental in having Tyndall executed for heresy under Henry VIII in 1536, which is a bit bittersweet and ironic, because just 3 years later, Henry VIII had his Great Bible, which was the first authorized English Bible, and it's almost exclusively from Tyndall. So kind of a very, very sad and unfortunate story. We'll talk about a few of these coins. I do want to point out one just as a teaser. Under the temple tax story in Matthew, he uses the translation of a piece of 20 pence. So it's a neat exercise to figure out what a piece of 20 pence might have been in 1526, but don't have time to really cover that today. So going on to the next slide, we finally see our mite. Our widow's mite has finally appeared. This was put in by Tyndall in 1526. The coin, of course, is the small pruta that is being a surrogate for. The mite was not an English coin; it was a Belgian coin or a Flemish coin. And what I've shown here is a mite minted between 1434 and 1467. It's a Billon coin. This one has the shield of Burgundy, along with Philip, the Duke of Burgundy's name. It's a long cross type coin. It has that cross on the reverse and says Monique de Flan, money of Flanders. So this was a coin that was minted a little bit before Tyndall's time. But he obviously would have been familiar with it given his time in the Low Country while he was sort of in exile, if you will. He spent a lot of time there. He certainly would have been familiar with it. And this coin was minted until the mid-1500s. It's interesting that even though it stopped being minted in the mid-1500s, it continued to appear in Bibles for centuries thereafter. So it's amazing how much staying power that had. And the term had been around for a while. Chaucer used it in his Canterbury Tales back in the 1387 to 1400 time period. Had a line in there that says "not worth a mite." Not sure if he was referring to a coin or just to a value or a quantity, probably the latter. I find the history aspect interesting here because Chaucer, it turned out, was a good friend of Wycliffe, who we heard about earlier and did a translation, yet Wycliffe was not the one to put the mite into the Bible. It came much later from Tyndall. So this mite is obviously larger than the pruta. It's lighter than the pruta by a little bit. And it's not worth much. It's worth between 1/76th and 1/32nd of a stiver, a stiver in the Flemish coin system at the time, which is worth about a half of an English farthing, but still worth more than the lowly lepton at 1/128th of a denarius. Going to, again, the ubiquitous penny from Tyndall. It's a substitute for the denarius we've seen before on the right. And on the left, the Tyndall coin that I have here is a penny minted, silver penny minted in England between 1530 and 1544. The inscription, and this does have an image, it's kind of hard to see there, but that is an image of Henry VIII. And the inscription says Henry VIII rose without a thorn, which I thought was a bit ironic of an inscription, given that he's the one who executed Tyndall who put this in the Bible. The other neat historical connection with this particular coin is that if you look at the reverse, to the sides of the shield, there's a C on the left and a D on the right. The C stands for the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall, the man who was responsible really for denying Tyndall permission and having him executed. And then the D is for the Durham Mint, which is an ecclesiastical mint. There were both royal mints and ecclesiastical mints at this time. This was a way that the monasteries were able to get their money until Henry realized that was a cash cow and put a big end to all of that and other things during his tenure. It's obviously of similar size to the denarius. It is much thinner and much lighter, and due to inflation, again, we're at about 3.3 pence per day daily wage, and that's the daily wage of an unskilled laborer, farmer type situation. It's worth less than the denarius in this particular case. Going on to the groat from Tyndall. This is interesting. It's the first time we've seen anything larger than a penny really appear, more value than a penny. This is put in as a surrogate for the drachma that we had talked about before, and it's the coin shown is a silver groat dated between 1529 and 1532. Again, it's a coin of Henry VIII. The inscription here says, "I have made God my helper," which I always gives me suspect when I associate that with Henry VIII. You see the crests of England and France there on the reverse. It's a thinner coin. It's slightly lighter than the drachma, but much larger. And actually, it's a good match. It has similar worth to the drachma. It also has similar worth to the denarius. So it's a little perplexing as to why he would have translated a groat for the drachma and not done the same thing for the denarius. And I think it comes back to just the inertia of the legacy of using penny for that. That just was so strong and so entrenched that people wanted to continue that, even when the value really didn't necessarily correlate with that as well. Now we'll go on to the King James Version, published in 1611. This was a very different sort of translation. This was authorized by King James I. It was done by committee, which was different. 47 scholars worked on this for a period of 7 years. So it was quite an undertaking. It did have a lot of similarities to the Geneva Bible done in 1560, where verse numbers were added for the first time, yay. But once again, it's 84% of the King James Version came from Tyndale, just to show you the power of and importance of the Tyndale translation. But of course, the King James Version is extremely important in its own right. It's the most printed of all the translations by far. There's been over 1 billion copies printed. And even today, with many translations available and so much time passing, it's still the second best-selling translation today. I put the Wesley Bible in here too. This was from 1755. This was by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. He didn't make any changes to the coins that are in his translation, but during this period between 1611 and 1755, the coins themselves changed quite a bit. So I wanted to cover that. You could also ascribe that to what's known as the King James Version Oxford Update of 1769, similar sort of period. And that really is, it mainly fixed spelling type errors or spelling type updates. And that's really the version. When we talk about the King James Version today, we're really talking about pretty much the 1769 update version. So I'll talk about the coins there that we see highlighted. Starting with the farthing, this was a substitute for both the quadrands we've talked about before in the upper right and the Assyrian we've talked about before in the lower right. And the coin here is a farthing. It's a copper farthing now. This was the first copper farthing, I believe. This was from 1613, so right about the time of the King James Version. This was a James the First farthing, but it was actually not printed by James. It was printed by Lord Harrington. So it was a token that was done under a patent provided to Lord Harrington by James the First. One of the reasons that I liked, or I already had this coin, actually, my coin collecting began about 5 years ago with colonials. And this is a coin that is very much similar to coins found at Jamestown and Martin's Hundred in Virginia. So I actually originally collected this as a colonial, and it served double purpose here as a Bible translator coin. It's similar in size to the quadrant, obviously much smaller than the Assyrian. It's thinner than both. It's lighter than both. It's still worth more than the quadrants, but less than the Assyrian, so it does kind of fit in nicely between the two. The ubiquitous penny, again, from the King James Version. This is a substitute, once again, for the denarius. The penny I'm showing here is a silver penny minted between 1607 and 1609. It is a coin of James the First. It does not have his image, so once again, you have the whose image is on this coin question here. It does have, instead of his image, it has a Tudor rose on one side representing England and a thistle representing Scotland on the other side. James had been king of Scotland before he was king of England, and he was the first king to really unite those. It's similar in size to the denarius, but thinner and lighter. And now we're up to, with inflation, the daily wage is up to about 8 pence per day. So this is worth actually much less now than the denarius. So going on to Wesley's, John Wesley's time of 1755, or you could equally call this the time of the Oxford update to the King James Version in 1769. We see now that the farthing is a royal farthing made out of copper that was started in 1672. It was substituted for both the quadrands and the Assyrian, shown on the right. It is a farthing of George II from 1749. And again, with the colonial connection, 1749 is a year that England shipped a large number of farthings and halfpence to the colonies. So it's a popular year for colonial collectors, an important year for colonial collectors. This coin is obviously larger than the quadrands, but smaller than the Assyrian, and it actually turns out to be worth value is very similar to the quadrands and less than the Assyrian. Again, the ubiquitous penny from Wesley, again substituted for the denarius there shown on the right. This is a silver penny of George II from 1753. During this period, silver coins were not really minted. In fact, this is the only coin minted in 1753, and it was only minted to satisfy the needs of Maundy Monday. I'm not sure I have time to go through Maundy Monday in any detail, but it's coming up on April the 1st this year, and the Queen, since she's now 95 years old, she will give 95 pence to 95 men and 95 women for their humanitarian service. But these are special coins that are probably worth thousands of pounds total on the market, so to speak. I would say this coin is much smaller than the denarius. It's thinner, it's lighter, And with inflation now putting the daily wage around 11 pence, it's worth quite a bit less than the denarius. Going now to my final translation, this is the American Standard Version. Interesting story here. In 1870, a group of British and American scholars got together to work together on a new translation. And this ultimately led to what's called the British Revised Version in 1881. And the US scholars made a lot of suggestions and contributions, and all of them were pretty much ignored by the English. So after a suitable agreed to cooling off period, the Americans said, well, we'll publish our own. And they did that, starting with the New Testament in 1900, and they put their suggestions in there. I find it interesting that even though it's an American translation, they use British coins, although they did use quite different denominations than what was being used in the British translations. I'll also point out here that for the first time that in my encounters, we actually start to see the original terms come back here. So for the story with the imperial tax to Caesar, they actually go back to using denarius instead of trying to put a comparable English coin in here. Now, we still use a lot of English coin substitutes for denarius in other areas, but where they actually give the coin to Caesar, I think that works out nicely, because now you still have Caesar's image being on that denarius coin rather than on an English coin. So I think a lot of foresight went into. I'm very impressed, and you'll see part of the reason why, as well as we go forward with this. From a numismatic point of view, this American Standard Version is just very impressive. Part of it is, for the first time, there was a half farthing available. And so it's not explicitly called a half farthing in the Bible, but it does say that 2 mites equal a farthing. And since there was a half farthing coin at this point in time, that pretty much implies that a mite was equal to a half farthing. So again, this is a substitute for the small pruta. The half farthing we see here is a half farthing copper coin minted in 1844 for Queen Victoria. It's obviously larger and heavier than the small pruta, and it's worth slightly less, but they're very close. A very good match, actually, value-wise. Going to the farthing from the American Standard Version, again, this is a match for the quadrands that we've seen before. This is a copper farthing of Queen Victoria in 1864. Again, it's larger, but it has similar mass, and while the value is slightly less, it is actually very close to the quadrands. A very good match there as well. And now we see our first copper penny. I think that was, I forget when that began, but it was well before this, but well after the last update that we talked about. And this was a surrogate now, not for the denarius, but for the Assyrian. And you see that it's very comparable in size. It's slightly less in mass. And again, the values are very close. It's worth slightly less than the Assyrian, but it's actually a very good match overall. And finally, for the denarius, the match that was used was a shilling. We see the shilling show up here for the first time as a coin. This is a silver shilling of Victoria, dated 1849. It's a little larger and slightly heavier than the denarius. The value is slightly less, but actually pretty close to the denarius. It's a good match on value, given in part that the daily wage now is up to about 30 pence per day. So try to summarize this. Here's my family album. This covers most of the slides that we talked about today. For the lepton, Assyrian, and denarius, which are the three that should really show up the most. So you can sort of get a feeling for visually there how they change in size and material. I find it interesting that we have a bit of bookends here. The ancient coins there are actually a very good match for the ones on the final on the right-hand side there for the American Standard Version. So I think that's the best match overall numismatically. You can sort of see the trend over time, how the leptons went from being farthings to being mites. And even though mites have not been minted since the mid-1500s, we still have the mite showing up very late in time, given that momentum. Obviously, the Oz was a real pain for the translators. You can see them going for between pennies and half pennies and farthings. Had a lot of trouble with that particular coin. And of course, the denarius was almost universally translated as a penny until we see this American Standard Version there at the last. And then to summarize, I've got a kind of an expanded table here where I show the time period of the different translations. I added in the quadrands, the stater, and the drachma, just to try to show the coins that were used in the translations. And let me just say here that I'm very impressed with the work these translators did. They had a big challenge on their hands to balance out, trying to match what was in the original Bibles, trying to match the history and tradition of the legacy translations in their language, trying to communicate the message to the people in a very current and tangible, relatable type context. And also there were certainly religious and political objectives that were behind most of these as well. It's an interesting exercise to review these and compare these and critique their choices. But let me just point out that none of these in any way affect the intent or the message of the gospel. No one's going to lose the message of the widow's contribution, whether that's called a mite or it's called a farthing or it's called a halfpence. It took a lot of effort just to go back and study this for literally just a few dozen words in a few dozen verses. And the New Testament has like over 1,000 verses and 82,000 words. So hats off to these gentlemen who were doing this with minimal resources, and often their lives were in danger because of it. So really impressive there. But it's a fun collection. Obviously, it's a niche thing, but it was a fun journey. It was fun historically to study this, and there's still more I can do here, and I plan to do here. But there's a lot of different coins and different verses and different countries and different periods of history associated with the translators and translations and the coins and just the politics of the day, which is so there's a lot of fascinating avenues to pursue here. I've included some bibliographies here. The first three I call out Oliver Hoover's article in the A&S magazine, which really looks at sort of the coins associated specifically with King James at the time of King James. And then we see another article by Dr. Sanz, who looked at the Lindisfarne Gospels more from a linguistic point of view, a language point of view. She's a language scholar than a numismatic type terms. I've had some good conversations with her. I think she was delighted that people from a numismatic bent were finding her research interesting. And then my wages, so to speak, came from this article referenced here by George Clark. A lot of the standard Bible coin books are shown there. And the Syllogy books are very useful for picking out coins that match the place and the date of interest. And then finally, I've also included a bibliography of Bible type books and references. A lot of these are online. And if you get the chance to go to the British Library, they actually have these on display. And just like there's no substitute for seeing and holding a coin, there's no substitute for actually seeing some of these Bible translations in person, even though they're under glass, so you don't get to hold them. But at that point, I will close and open it up for questions.
All right, thanks a lot, Bill. It was really interesting. So we do have a few questions here. First up, is this on New Testament coins or Lindisfarne Gospels? I think basically you covered really both the ancient coins and the medieval coins.
Right, I covered the ancient ones just for the context, but you could spend a whole talk or many talks on those. There's a lot of that's been covered previously, so I didn't want to retrace that ground.
Next one, Rose Without a Thorn is also the name of one of Henry VIII's musical compositions. Perhaps this was a motto of his.
Yeah, it's an interesting phrase. It does appear on some other monarchs' coins as well, I think. I don't know if he was the first or not. I'd have to look that up. But I always chuckle it in context with Henry.
All right, next one came in a little late, so apologize if this was mentioned at the beginning. But there's an interesting biblical allusion on the farthings of South Africa from the 1920s and 1960s, the reverse design being two sparrows. I also assume the Sauntus for drachma in Wycliffe is a bezant, which sounds like a much higher value than the surrounding shillings and groats.
Yeah, I think that drachma gave people a lot of trouble, a lot more trouble than the denarius, and you'll see that that is a bezant. I believe he's referring to an older Byzantine coin. We saw the thremsis was also referenced in that context as well. I think maybe there was some uncertainty about what those coins might have really been worth. And of course, there was a lot of debasing going on too. So by the time of Aldred, for example, the thremsis that he mentions had probably gone through extreme debasement and was certainly not worth anything near what a solid gold or high carat gold coin would be worth.
And I was not aware of the South Africa farthing with the two sparrows. That's interesting as well.
Yeah, I've heard of that before. Actually, when I heard about it, the context, I think it was Mike Markowitz was given a talk, and he mentioned he thought it for years. He thought it was a sparrow, but then he was informed by a bird watcher that it was not a sparrow. It was a wren or something else. But I'm not a bird watcher, so I can't speak to that.
I think as numismatists, we're sensitive. We see references to coin collecting in a lot of the national media and so forth, and they get in trouble very quickly. They usually mess things up. So it's nice to see that, on this very narrow issue within biblical translation, that there was considerable attention paid to get in every single word as accurate as possible.
Yeah, I think it's very impressive, the effort that went into it, and the effort of I had no idea there was this scholarly, I'm an engineer, so that there was a whole community of linguists that, they're really, their entire professional lives are studying these glosses and similar type documents and trying to, they look at every word and see, they try to determine, was it written by the same person or multiple people at different times, and what's the accent, and it got way over my head, but it was incredible how much detail of study goes into that.
Yeah, and it's remarkable to think that someone like Luther really translated the entire thing into German.
Yeah, he was amazing. I mean, and the magnitude of that, the effects that had on other translators, the effects that had on the whole German language, German literature, period, I had no idea, and that was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, he must have had just an extraordinary command of Latin and German. It's really amazing. All right, is the PowerPoint available?
Yeah, I don't know what the NNP is going to do for those, but if someone wants to contact me, I'd be glad to. Be glad to send that out, or send that out through ULAN, however, whatever you'd suggest on that.
Sure. You can share your contact information now, or they can get it through me.
Yeah, let's have them just get it through you.
Okay. So you can just contact NNP curator at WUSTL, which is WUSTL.edu, and I can make the connection. All right, I think that's it for the questions. So thank you very much. This is a fascinating presentation.
Well, thank you. It's been a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot with it, and I appreciate the opportunity to share it.
Excellent. All right, thanks a lot.